When the bottom drops out, who do you turn to? When the bottom drops out, where is God? Joseph, now to hear his story, Joseph has been rattling on and on and on about these dreams that he has. Dreams that irritate the daylights out of his older brothers, because these dreams were that there would come a point at which these older brothers would bow down to him and he would lord it over them. He'd be the one who runs the show. He would be the big brother in terms of clout and all of that sort of thing. Sort of sounds like the story that his dad played out. Remember the struggle between Jacob and Esau? We've talked about that for several weeks as they struggled back and forth after Jacob had stolen from his brother the birthright that should have gone to the older brother. So this is a story that's now playing itself out in the second generation as Joseph begins to tell how he is going to be the big brother in terms of emotional clout and spiritual clout, physical clout, and all of these other brothers would be bowing down to him one of these days. Sooner or later, that's how it was going to work out. And you can imagine how well that went over. Anybody here had a kid brother try to tell him what big shots that were? Jacob is a kid brother. He's smart enough to know it. The older brothers had listened to this just about as long as they could stand it. They were getting pretty well fed up with the whole thing. As I said, Joseph was also his dad's favorite son. Joseph was the son born of Rachel, the favorite wife, and so he automatically sort of gained some status, even though he was number 11 in the birth order instead of number 1. He's daddy's favorite son, and he gets to demonstrate he's daddy's favorite son by wearing that amazing Technicolor dream coat. You have seen the show, no doubt, heard the musical. Now, the translation may not be exactly correct literally, but symbolically, the translation is absolutely dead on. That amazing Technicolor dream coat and everything it symbolized is what Joseph claimed for himself in relationship to his brothers, in relationship to his dad. Joseph, the obnoxious dreamer, also turns out, we heard it in the story, to be a tattletale. Anybody here ever had a tattletale sibling? You know how well that went over. It just doesn't fly worth a hoot. He's been bringing home all these bad reports to Daddy about how the older brothers are not doing a very good job with the sheep out in the pasture land. And in those days, because everybody grazed their animals, sometimes you had to take a flock quite some distance from home. So the brothers are way out over there, many miles from home, grazing the sheep, and Dad sends Jacob or Joseph from time to time to find out how things are going. And the reports come back not very favorable. Now, we don't know whether the reports were true or not. It doesn't matter, because what matters is that this sort of tattletale was already setting his brothers up to be looked down even more. Until the brothers got their belly full. You heard in the story, the brothers had finally had enough. They decide that it is time now to kill this tattletale, obnoxious brother of theirs. Kill him out there in the wilderness and soak that despised Technicolor dream coat in blood and take the whole mess back to Dad and tell him how the whole story has now come to a terrible and tragic end. Now, this is an obnoxious kid, no doubt about that. But he is also a dreamer, we have said. A dreamer. And that sounds different in the biblical tradition than it sounds in our ears. A dreamer in the biblical tradition was somebody who had sort of an inside track to God's will. The dreams were understood as revelation, at least sometimes, and you didn't know going into it whether it really was or not, so you had to respect the dream because it was somehow, perhaps, a revelation from God. And maybe the dreamer knew something that the rest of us didn't know. Which means that to stifle Joseph's dream, or to kill Joseph's dream, or to sell Joseph's dream off to slavery in Egypt might be to try to kill God's dream, or maybe to force God out of God's plan, or to somehow maybe squeeze God into a plan B so that God has to go over here and try to do all of this in a different way instead of the way God intended for it to be, because who knows whether the dream is really how God intended to do it or not. But the brothers don't care. They have their belly full of all this nonsense, And so you know the story. They concocted this scheme and to get rid of their brother, and they slaughtered the animal, and they soaked this wonderful coat in the animal's blood. They tattered the thing all up, took the coat back to Jacob, and you can hear the song in your head already, can't you? One more angel in heaven, one more star in the sky. Joseph will never forget you. It's tough, but we're going to get by. One less place at the table, one more tear in our eye. But Joseph, the things that you stood for, like truth and light, never die. They sang the song with all the feeling they could muster to make sure that it was convincing to Dad. And then they stepped over the dream, and off they went to do what they intended to do, just like that. So it was that the bottom fell out. The bottom fell out of Joseph's dream. The bottom fell out of Joseph's hope. And in many ways, the bottom fell out of Joseph's life. Poor Joseph. What you gonna do? Things look bad for you. Hey, what you gonna do? When the bottom drops out, what you gonna do? When the bottom drops out, what are you going to do? When the bottom falls out of your dream, when the bottom falls out of your hope, when the bottom falls out of your life, what are you going to do? Now let me mix the images up a little bit and pull an image from today's gospel reading. At the command of Jesus, you're in the boat with Peter, and you step out of the boat with Peter onto that water, and you begin to walk out of the water, or on the water like this water. The water of baptism. You step into the water and you start to walk in the water of baptism, and the storms start to stir up and the wind starts to stir up and all of that. Please understand something. Baptism makes you special. Baptism makes you special. Baptism is very much like that amazing Technicolor dream coat, except that when you were baptized, the coat was given to every one of us. So it is very much like that very special coat that Joseph received. Like Joseph, you are special. You are special. You belong to Jesus in a special way. That's part of what baptism means. Just like the coat meant that Joseph and his father were somehow specially linked. Baptism means that you are specially linked to Jesus. All of you, each of us, every one of us. Your life has been joined to Jesus' life so that your life and his life are one. And you remember how all that worked out. You probably can quote from the Apostles' Creed. We're using the Nicene Creed this morning, but you remember the Apostles' Creed, what it says about Jesus: suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, dead, buried, and in the old creed, descended into hell. Bottom dropped out of his dream. Bottom dropped out of his hope. The bottom dropped out of his life. And because you are associated with him, you're kind of down there with him as well. So I suppose it shouldn't be too surprising when the bottom drops out of your life or out of mine. And I did say when, not if. Because sooner or later, at least once, maybe more than once, one way or another, the bottom drops out. When the bottom drops out, how do you hang on to hope? When the bottom drops out, how do you hang on to a dream? When the bottom drops out, how do you hang on to life? When the bottom drops out, will you join Joseph in that dungeon down there in Egypt? When the bottom drops out, will you join Jesus in the tomb? Will you wait with those who have learned how to wait? Will you wait with those who have learned how to wait until the time comes when God is ready to act again, when the time comes when God is ready to do what God intends to do? We all know the rest of the story. We've seen the musical, we've been to Sunday school, so we know that we're only in the middle of Joseph's story, not the end of it. We know that we're only in the middle of Jesus' story, that Easter Sunday is going to come. We all know that. But that's a story for another day, not for today. The story for today is the bottomless pit. The story for today is the crashing and hungry waves. The story of Joseph, who endured. The story of Peter, who cried out for help. The story of Jesus, who took on death. in order to struggle to defeat it. And maybe your story too, because maybe you struggle, because maybe you cry out for help, because maybe you still dare to hope to believe in Jesus. When the bottom drops out, can these stories help you hope? When the bottom drops out, can these stories